Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining today is my good friend and longtime colleague, Ryan Quint. Ryan, how are you today?
Doing all right, Chris. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm delighted to have you with us today. Ryan is I think, one of the great young historians I've had the chance to work with. Maybe not as young as he was when I first started working with him. But geez, talk about a dude who's just got the chops. And when he wrote his Monocracy book for the Emerging Civil War series a couple years ago, I was so excited to have him kind of make his writing debut on the stage. And now he's got his first hardcover, which to me is super excited. The Battle of Dranesville. Ryan, tell us about Dranesville.
Yeah, it's a little battle in December of 1861. Not too many people have heard of it, which is exciting, in the sense that when you're looking for a Civil War project, everything's been done. So to find something that hasn't really been talked about was really exciting. Dranesville is a small town in Fairfax County. It's equidistant from Washington, D.C. and Leesburg, Virginia. And in 1861, the entire town was just thrown into chaos. Unionists, secessionists were at each other's throats. And then the armies come to town, and that adds in a whole other layer. So it's a really cool story of a town, its occupants, and a battle, which I had a lot of fun with kind of diving into the story.
What I think is really cool about it too is that there's a cast of well-known characters involved with this forgotten battle. Hit some of those highlights for us. We can talk in more detail in a second, but hit some of those highlights for the cast.
Yeah, so without a doubt, probably the most famous participant is Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart, at the time of the battle, was still a brigadier general. He's in charge of about 2,500 Confederates who go to Dranesville, and he gets his butt kicked. So it's not exactly a feather in his cap. The person who did the butt kicking was Edward Ord, who, of course, ends the war in charge of the Army of the James, is present during the Appomattox surrender proceedings. And Ord was a brigadier general when the battle was fought. So you've got two officers who are pretty new to their command experience. Then, as far as kind of famous units, probably the most famous would be the Pennsylvania Reserves, the same guys who break through Jackson's line at Fredericksburg or charge into the Valley of Death at Gettysburg. Dranesville is their very first combat action.
So a lot of kind of neat characters and cast members that you can work with as you're telling this story. One of the things, and I was privileged to read a very early draft of this book and watch as it developed. So it's been, kind of a wonderful story for me to get interested in. One of the things I've found fascinating as far as cast members are those people of Dranesville themselves. You'd mentioned that there's a lot of mixed sentiment, and you talk in the book a lot about how these neighbors are at each other's throats.
Yeah, so I mean, I know it's hard to tell in 2024, but politics have always been vitriolic. And I know, again, it's going to come as a surprise, but especially in the 19th century, the act of voting was a very public affair. People knew how you voted. It was a public proceeding, and especially in the secession vote, right? When Virginia secedes, it's not just a bunch of politicians say we're out. There was a public referendum held in May of 1861. And the Unionists in Dranesville itself, who were very highly outnumbered, were known to the people of Dranesville, and they started to have to deal with the ramifications of their very public Unionist feelings being known. And that all boils down to eventually many of these Unionists fleeing to Washington, D.C., and seeking refuge among Union officials. A number of the Confederate sympathizing civilians were eventually arrested and were actually put on kind of a trial for their mistreatment of Unionist civilians. And so a lot of those records are part of the State Department records and the National Archives, which I was able to pull. And kind of their trial and kind of their proceedings. And so, yeah, it's a really fascinating story that has never really been covered in great detail. I think our mutual friend, a park historian named Noel Harrison, pointed me in the direction of the civilian struggle. Noel knows everything, which is just crazy. And he said, "Yeah, I wrote an
True
article."
story, though. True story. He does know
Yes.
everything.
And Noel was saying, "Oh, I wrote an article so many years back about civilians in Fairfax and Alexandria. You should look into that." And I was like, "Of course you did, Noel." I found the article, and of course it pointed me in the right direction with its footnotes. But yeah, it really fleshed that story out. and hope to tell the civilian side of the story as well. And hopefully something I succeeded in.
I appreciate you giving Noel a shout out. He's one of those unsung heroes, I think, that has been so gracious to me over my career, to you over your career.
Oh yeah,
Just super generous in the direction and guidance and support he's offered to so many young historians.
absolutely.
You started thinking about this project. What is it that kindled you about this unknown battle that you decided, yeah, I really want to invest some time and energy in this?
Yeah, so it's going to be a familiar story to you and I, Chris, and that is the wounding of Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville, right? Jackson goes down the night of May 2nd, 1863, the victim of friendly fire. Everyone knows that story. And it leaves the Confederate Second Corps in kind of a command conundrum. A.P. Hill, who's Jackson's successor, he goes down wounded. And then the big question mark is, well, who the heck's going to lead now? And eventually the decision is made to put Jeb Stuart in charge. And I would tell this story on tours and programs working at the park. And I would ask myself, well, Jeb Stuart is in charge of cavalry, right? What the heck is this guy doing in charge of 28,000 infantry? And so I started to ask myself, well, had there been a time that Jeb Stuart had commanded infantry before? And so I went back in the records and a couple of skirmishes here and there, sure, but Dranesville kept coming out, and I was like, what the heck is Dranesville? I considered myself, pretty well educated on the war, and I hadn't even heard of it before. And so yeah, I started to look into it more and more, and then that's how this whole thing came about. And aside from a couple of articles published in old Civil War Times magazines, no one had really done anything with it. And so I decided, hey, I think this is a story that is worth telling. And so I set out to tell that story. And that was, oh geez, that was 7 years ago. It's taken me 7 years to do this thing.
And you've had a pandemic and you've had publishing delays because of supply chain issues. So, not all those 7 years have just been paging through archives, but you've done a lot of archival work as you pulled this together. Tell us a little bit about your process for researching this story.
Yeah, so it's really cool you mentioned that. Especially with the pandemic, a lot of the archives have been really helpful, right? Especially 2020, 2021, 2022, when these archives were kind of off limits. Um, I was able to ask the librarians and the archivists for help. So, for example, Edward Ord's papers are in Stanford, California. And so I emailed them and I said, hey, I'm doing this project. I can't get there. And they were very gracious in sending me scans of Ord's papers. That's just one example. A close friend, Maureen Lavelle, she went to look at Thomas Kane's papers at Brigham Young University in Utah for me. Thomas Kane, who commanded a regiment of Pennsylvania Reserves at Dranesville, so his papers were extremely useful. I've already mentioned the National Archives a few times. The Library of Congress had things I used. And then I would say probably the other one that was most heavily cited is the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, or the former Virginia Historical Society. That's where a lot of Jeb Stuart's papers are. It's where a lot of private soldiers' accounts were. And so I think those archives were the most popular, we'll say, is the ones that I used. But yeah, I think if people pick up the book and flip to the back of the bibliography, I'm pleased with it, right? How many archives I was able to hit and ping and find things for sure. It's just a matter of digging.
And to me, that was so fascinating because, it's easy to research Chancellorsville. A lot of places have that stuff. The park has a fantastic library and research materials for that. There's not like a big central depository of Dranesville information. So you kind
No.
of had to build your own research library as you went.
Yeah, for sure. And the really cool thing about 21st century research and writing is the power of the internet, right? For anyone who doesn't know, there's a really great website called Archive Grid, which is a deposit. It's a listing essentially of archives. And if you have a keyword search, you can pop it in, and it will bring back results of where different artifacts and archives are. And so I used Archive Grid a ton. Keyword searches for Dranesville, Fairfax, Jeb Stuart, Edward Ord, Pennsylvania Reserves. And then it's just a matter of culling. And so, it's you still got to do the hard work. You got to put boots on the ground and figure it all out. But the power of the internet is immense, right? So for people who are saying, how do you even start, right? Archive Grid, World Catalog or WorldCat is a listing of where books are in various libraries. So the internet is your friend in this case. Go ahead and use its assets.
Yeah, it's amazing to me just how much stuff is now available digitally that, never used to be available. And you had to literally go boots on the ground to some places. And now this technology makes things so much more accessible. And it's just really opened up research in incredible ways, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure.
So this is an early war encounter. What are the stakes at Dranesville as this encounter unfolds?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing at stake is the war is not off to a good start for the United States and the Union war effort, right? Um, Defeat at First Bull Run, defeat at Wilson's Creek, all the way out in Missouri, defeat at Ball's Bluff. And so people are starting to say, well, what the heck, man? This was supposed to be a quick one and done, and this is not happening. And Dranesville, which is a Union victory, small in scale, was huge at the time. You look at newspapers, you look at accounts, you look at even post-war tellings. It brings up this really badly needed morale boost for Union forces. Again, it's not. I'm not going to sit here and say Dranesville was a turning point. It didn't change the outcome of the war, but it brought a badly needed antidote for people who were wondering what the heck is happening. The fact that it happens, the battle is December 20th, 1861. So it comes right before the new year, and it kind of gives these people kind of this uplift. The other thing that's at stake is the fact that at the time, at least, Fairfax County was becoming kind of a no man's land, right? The Confederate Army was in Centerville. Union Army was in the environs of Washington, D.C. And so it was a basic need for supplies, right? How do you feed these armies of tens of thousands of men with tens of thousands of horses? And so the area around Dranesville again kind of became a no man's land where both sides were scouting and foraging for food. And so both forces, the Pennsylvania Reserves under Ord and Jeb Stuart, went to Dranesville with the intention of getting food, and it turned into a fight from there. And so those are I guess the two big things at stake. It's a foraging expedition that turns into a very badly needed Union morale boost in the wake of all of these other defeats elsewhere.
So how is it that, big at the time, and yet it has fallen off the grid?
Yeah, so I think the most obvious example or the most obvious answer is bigger, bloodier battles followed, right? Um, for Confederates, it was interesting to look at their experiences because they were very quick to forget the battle themselves. They didn't write a whole lot about it after the fact. They wanted to look to bigger and better things. And for Confederate veterans of Dranesville, they fight at Williamsburg, the 7 Days, Second Manassas. You're going to talk about that, right? Those are the glory days. You're doing okay. You're not going to look back and say, "Wow, that was awful." And so even for Confederate forces, it very quickly started to get overlooked. For Union forces, it's really interesting because the Pennsylvania Reserves, like I've mentioned a few times, one of the more famous units of the entire United States Army during the war. And yet, after their experience, when it comes time to dedicate their monuments or have veteran reunions, they have it around Dranesville. Their anniversaries are held around the anniversary of Dranesville. Or when they dedicate their monuments at Gettysburg, the Ninth PA Reserves, for example, is a good example. They mention Dranesville in their commemoration speeches as, these is where we started. So it's interesting that both, the two sides have very different reactions to this battle, which helped to kind of lead to its memory fading over time. There was never a park created at any level, county, state, or national park. The Battle of Dranesville was fought right on what is today Virginia Route 7. It's not very far from Dulles Airport. And so the matter of preservation or lack of preservation also plays a huge role in there's nothing there, right? And so if there's nothing there to see or commemorate, people aren't going to realize what it is. There's not going to be an annual commemoration or anything to a large degree. There are others we'll talk about, but yeah, no park to go to.
Any like Civil War trail signs, any monuments, anything like that people could see?
Yeah, so there is a Civil War trail sign, right? Shout out to Drew Gruber. So there are a couple of signs. It's interesting that the signs are actually a couple miles in the wrong direction, right? For example, there is a county-owned building called the Dranesville Tavern about 2 miles from the battlefield, and that's where the sign is. Because until fairly recently, there wasn't anywhere else to put the sign until there was an Eagle Scout project. a kid named Matthew Moyle wanted to do an Eagle Scout project to commemorate the battle. And he worked in close conjunction with a church who owned some land right on the battlefield. And Matthew's dad, John, reached out to me a few years ago for some help. And we kind of, I did very little of the work. I just kind of helped answer some research questions. So Matthew deserves a lot of the credit. And Matthew eventually did succeed in putting a sign up. And so if you go to, it's called the Dranesville Church of the Brethren. If you go there, they have a really awesome sign right in the front yard talking about the battle. So for the first time since the battle was fought, there is a sign in the correct spot that talks about the fighting. Edward Alexander, another good friend of Emerging Civil War and a member of Emerging Civil War, did the map for the sign. So it, might be a little biased, but I think the sign is a smashing success.
Oh, fantastic. And, to kind of point out, the sign in the wrong spot, uh, you got to put the sign where you're allowed to put the sign, and if that's the
Exactly.
place where they said, hey, you can put a sign here, that's better than no signage at all. So
Exactly. Exactly.
kudos to the Trails folks for that.
Yeah.
Um, so as you continue to explore this story, um, how did it help you better understand kind of your own processes and your own thoughts about this early part of the war?
Yeah. So I think, in the years that I have worked in public history and I've been I guess, a military historian, I've come to appreciate the bigger picture stuff. I mean, I'll always have an appreciation for the X's and O's and all of that, but where does this all fit in the bigger picture has something that I've started to look into, right? Which is why I think I wanted to make the civilian part of the story such a significant part of the story. My original intent was to write a micro history of the Battle of Dranesville, something I still think I've done, right? If you read the book, I think you get a pretty good understanding of what happened during the battle. But
I agree. I'll just offer a little endorsement there.
thank you. Appreciate that. But yeah, a huge part of the story is the civilian experience. And so just myself, right, over the last few years, changing how I approach the story, I think is a revelation on how I've changed as a historian. These places, whether it be Dranesville as a small example or Fredericksburg or Gettysburg, were not just empty fields. They were lived in communities with their own history even before the armies showed up. And I think that was a huge part of telling the full story of that experience.
You mentioned that you came to this because of the Jeb Stewart question. What did you learn about Stewart as you spent time with him in this particular story?
Yeah, I have a newfound appreciation for Stewart, not necessarily for the cause or anything, but just as a guy. You read the letters, and he was just hilarious, right? And I think part of it is the age, right? Jeb Stewart was my age, or even a little younger, when the battle was fought, and so I think there's a kindred spirit there. But if you read his letters, he's just funny. A good example is his brother William sends him a block of cheese in the mail, and he thanks his brother for the cheese, and he writes in it, "For which I long ago demolished." And just the verbiage of demolished gives me the impression of Stewart sitting at a campfire with this block of cheese and a penknife, and he's just going to town on it, right? He didn't eat the cheese, he didn't enjoy the cheese, he demolished the cheese. So just this funny guy, right? 28, 29, 30, as the war goes on, and just a funny person. But at the same time, right, he does have a little bit of that kind of panache and that search for glory that people know. Um, After the battle is fought and he gets kind of raked over the coals, he whines and he says, do I have no friends in Congress who can stand up for me? And there were people who were actually saying that Stewart should be relieved of command, right? This is not the Jeb Stewart who rides around McClellan yet. This is still someone that no one really knows who he is. And yeah, there are people who are basically implying that he's only a glory hound, and that's why this bad thing happened. He rushes into a battle. But yeah, I think if you read Stewart's letters, you have a newfound appreciation for just the comedic value of his side of life.
When you talk about him as a kindred spirit, now I've got an image of you with an ostrich plumed hat. It's probably sitting on the bookcase right behind him. We can't
Yeah,
even see it. Yeah.
yeah, there you go.
So, so he does not perform especially well at Drainsville, leading a small infantry force. How does he then become the Jeb Stewart that we all know?
Yeah, I think the School of Hard Knocks has a lot to do with that, right? Um, we talk about lessons learned and staff rides and what can we learn from this and so on and so on. And Jeb Stuart does that. He starts to learn the basics of how to do things. One of the things at Dranesville that leads to his demise is he puts his artillery in the wrong spot. Edward Ord, in a letter to his own wife, Edward Ord said that the rebel opposing him, Stuart, was, quote, an ignoramus. All right, well, there you go. So Stuart's artillery battery just gets the stuffing knocked out of it. It's the worst casualties they suffered during the entire war. And that was the Sumter Light Artillery out of Georgia. And so Stuart takes that lesson. Okay, don't do that. Do something else. And so by the spring of 1862, even though he's in charge of cavalry and all of that, he's learning these lessons and he's taking them away and he's kind of learning the ropes. And then he turns into the Jeb Stuart that rides around McClellan, and then he turns into the Jeb Stuart who defends Nicodemus Heights at Antietam and all of that. So I think a part of it is just the process of learning how to command large forces. You're talking about a guy who was a dragoon officer before the war, in charge of maybe a company, and now he's in charge of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. It's going to take time to learn. So I think that's, and it bears out at Chancellorsville. It's a pretty simple strategy. The enemy are over there, go find them, which is what he does on May 3rd. But he also does a really solid job at Spotsylvania in May of 1864, where he's tasked with defending Laurel Hill before the Confederate infantry can show up. And he does a really good job of commanding combined arms, some of his cavalry troopers, infantry, and some artillery. And so it's kind of bookended, right? He's killed a few days later. It's bookended with a not great experience at Dranesville. He defends Laurel Hill successfully, and then 4 days later, he's dead.
How does he make that shift from infantry to cavalry?
So yeah, it's interesting. Stuart was always in charge of cavalry. He was just also in the fall of 1861 specifically, he was in charge of, quote, the advance outposts of the army. And from my research, what I could figure is that these infantry regiments were on picket duty, and they would generally switch, every 48 hours or 2 days or whatever it might be. And so for my reading into the sources, it just seems like the regiments he took to Dranesville was kind of their turn, right? It was just they happened to be on duty. He worked in close conjunction with James Longstreet, who was also in charge of advanced Confederate outposts. And so as the army gets reorganized in the spring of 1862 around Yorktown, he was already in charge of the Confederate Army's cavalry. He had been in charge of that. It's just kind of this one particular moment of the advance outposts. Those few Confederate infantry regiments, kind of luck of the draw, right? It just happened to be their turn, and so it wasn't like they were ever under Stuart's command personally. It was just their turn on the rotation, and so they end up fighting at Dranesville.
Tell me a little bit, switching gears. Tell me a little bit about Edward Ord, who's a guy that folks here in the East don't hear much about because he does get transferred out west.
Yeah.
What did you learn about spending time with him?
Yeah, so he's an interesting guy in the sense of up until the Civil War started, he'd been in the Army forever. He graduated West Point along with William T. Sherman, but a guy who action was always somewhere else, right? He gets sent to California. Well, the Mexican War had already died down by the time he showed up, and then he gets stationed to a fort in Washington Territory when the war starts, and it's really because he has friends in high places. A staff officer named Julius Garachet, who very famously was killed at Stones River, was a close friend of Ord's, and Garachet pulled some strings to get Ord assigned to the Virginia Theater of Operations. He's a guy who very stringently believes in drill, and so I guess thankfully the brigade he's assigned to, Pennsylvania Reserves, he drills them and he trains them and he instills in them the art of soldiery. So I guess kind of that crusty old army feeling to it. He's promoted because of Dranesville. He gets a promotion to major general in charge of a division. He spends some time around Fredericksburg in the spring of 1862 with Irvin McDowell, and then he gets sent out west. And he kind of becomes a Grant yes man. He is involved in the battles around Iuka and Corinth. He's involved in the siege of Vicksburg. And then he comes east again in charge of various elements before eventually, again, commanding the Army of the James. So the thing I take away from him is just kind of that crusty old army John Gibbon-esque kind of guy who drilled and trained and practiced because he knew what was about to happen. And he knew that it's going to take hard training because the other side is well trained. And he knows that because he went to West Point with those guys. And so he knows that, if we're going to do this, we better know what we're doing. And so train and drill and practice. The soldiers in his brigade are intimidated by Ord because Ord shows up and he's inspecting their muskets and he's yelling at them because he's finding little particles of rust on the barrels, and he's making them go through the motions. And these Pennsylvanians who were civilians maybe 2 months earlier are like, who the hell is this guy? So it's pretty impressive stuff. Yeah.
You talk about his relationship with Grant, and Ord actually has a bust in Grant's tomb. He's one of the generals that looks in
Yeah.
on Grant and Julia's sarcophagi down there. Um, so, anything else that was particularly surprising to you as you explored this story that you weren't expecting, and suddenly like, oh wait,
Yeah, I mean, I know I've harped on it a few times, but it's definitely the civilian experience.
yeah.
I mentioned in passing, Dranesville's only been discussed in magazine articles and whatnot, and every time it's been portrayed as a foraging expedition, and it was. We talked about that, trying to find food, but it's also the very active role of the civilians. Edward Ord, when he gets Ord gets orders to go to Dranesville. One of the very clear things delineated in his instructions, let's use that word, is to make sure that Unionist civilians in the area were protected. And so, written right in the official records as part of his instructions, go to Dranesville, secure the safety of Unionist civilians, then get food. And it always surprised me in these magazine articles that was never talked about. So definitely that part, right? And I know I've harped on it a few times, civilian, 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 but it's a huge story that had not been discussed until I started to kind of dig into it and
And no,
try.
I found it fascinating. I really did. How do those civilians deal after this small little battle happens? Everybody goes back to their corners, and neighbors have to continue on with daily life.
So it's kind of crazy in the sense of, as far as I can tell, when the war ends, they let bygones be bygones. I guess let's name the big three, if you will, right? William B. Day and his brother John T. Day were kind of the leaders of the secessionists in Dranesville. They joined this what's called Dranesville Home Guard. They don't join the army, but they join this home guard and they kind of ride around in the Gallivant. And some of their neighbors, right, Henry Bishop, Nelson Voorhees, Minor Crippen, are Unionists, and they argue during the war, but when the war ends, they just go back to life. William B. Day and John Day are town doctors. Minor Crippen, Nelson Voorhees, Henry Bishop go back to farming. And I looked in newspapers and I looked at everything after the war to see if there's any fights, cuffles, are they calling the sheriff? And I couldn't find anything. So they very quickly just go back to life the way it was before the war, which I thought was really surprising, just how quickly they go back to normal life.
Yeah,
But they do.
considering the tension ahead of time and the animosity that developed there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But they do. So
Yeah.
that's what the record said.
Wow. There's kind of to me a neat postscript to all this, and it sort of touches on that sense of reconciliation. They invite you to go to Dranesville now to celebrate the anniversary, and it happens around Christmas time. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's just kind of a really neat way for this story, your story, to kind of come to a conclusion.
Yeah, it's held at what's called the Dranesville Church of the Brethren, which I've mentioned a couple of times. And on an anniversary, sometimes on the anniversary or a date close to the battle, they'll have a commemoration. And I've worked in public history for a little while now, and it is one of the most powerful, compelling, interpretive programs I've ever seen, which is, you know, the Park Service and all of its professionals could watch this program and learn a thing or two, which is crazy because it's just these people who are invested in the story and want to tell it well. And what they essentially do is the Church of the Brethren are descended from the Quakers, and so they have a deep tenet to pacifism, and their program is based on that premise. War doesn't do anybody any good, right? Is basically their basic premise. And what they do to tell that story is they light candles, and there's one candle for every soldier who was killed at Dranesville. And it's a church, so they read relevant scripture and they sing some hymns and whatnot, and they provide historic backing to the battle. And eventually they turn all the lights out. And the only thing that's giving light are these candles, 75-ish candles. And then they read the names one at a time. And as they read the names, they put out the light, right? They take a little extinguisher and they put the candles out. And so they read the last name and they put out the last candle and it's pitch black. And the idea being, this is what war did, right? War took all of these lives, it snuffed out the lives, it snuffed out their energy. And then they kind of go from there. And the ultimate premise is right through the guiding light of religion and all of that, they have a way forward. But it's a really powerful, compelling moment because you watch these candles literally be snuffed out one at a time. And yeah, a couple of years ago, they've started to ask me to share some of my research, and I've tried to kind of give some personal stories to some of the soldiers who were killed. One example is Frank English, who was from the 6th South Carolina. He was 17 years old when he was killed at Dranesville, and he has letters at the University of South Carolina in Columbia written up to the battle, talking about his time in the Army, and it's a kind of a classic example of a kid who gets sucked into the patriotism and the glory in April of 1861 and very quickly realizes war is a whole different thing. He starts to write letters asking if his father can get him out of the army and he wants to go back to school and all of that. And he gets killed in his very first battle, in his very first skirmish, he gets killed. And so I think he is just one example of what that church service does. So it's really cool. It's open to the public. You don't need to be a member of the church. So if anyone's interested, I highly encourage you to go out because I know I've been going to it every year for about 5 or 6 years now, and every time I get chills, and every time it reminded me, what I was working towards. So yeah, the Dranesville Church of the Brethren is, yeah, they're up there in terms of really cool, impactful, interpretive experiences I've
Wow,
been to.
that's a wicked cool story.
Yeah, isn't it?
So as people come to your book, what do you hope they take away from
I hope they take away that every book doesn't have to be about Gettysburg, right?
it?
There are other stories in the Civil War than the Bergs, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Petersburg. Other stories that still need to be told. There are stories that still need to be told. Everyone, says, "Do we really need another book about the war?" Well, yeah, sure. I mean, there are other stories that need to be told. And so I hope that's the big takeaways. There are still stories that need to be told. The Civil War is still relevant to modern audiences. We still need things to take away from. And so I think that'd be the big takeaway is, what can we still take away 160 years later that this war is still teaching us?
Do you have a copy of the book with you? I'll put you on the spot here. Do you have a
I
copy?
do, yeah.
I want you to hold the book up.
Yeah,
So
yeah, here we go.
Drainsville, a Northern Virginia town in the crossfire of a forgotten battle, published by
Yeah,
Savis Beatty.
that is.
What's it like to hold that baby in your hand?
It was surreal. Yeah, the boxes came in a couple weeks ago and I opened them up and it was, yeah, 7 years of work just kind of came flooding forward, which is definitely a crazy experience. Like you said, it's a hardcover book, so that's a different beast entirely. Um, but yeah, it's really cool to see. What I'm not ready for is the what's next, Ryan, because I have no idea.
That
I
was
have
going to
no
be my
idea.
next question. So,
A long nap. I think of the long nap. Um, no, I think in seriousness, I think my next project will probably be a break from the Civil War. You work for the Civil War 40 hours a week, and then you work on this, and you need a little break. So I've always had an interest in the history of firefighting. My dad's a firefighter, and so I've always been around that. So probably something related to the history of firefighting, but don't hold me to
wow,
that because I have no idea.
wow. There's a cool little firefighters museum in Charleston, South Carolina. That they got some fantastic stuff. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
oh wow. Well, very, very good. Good luck to you
Well,
on,
thank you.
on that nap, if nothing else.
Yes, yes, exactly. Exactly.
So again, the book is Drainsville. It's available from Savis Beatty. You can get your hard copy there. Ryan, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us today.
Yeah, no, appreciate your time and thanks for sitting down with me.
Yeah, congratulations. A wonderful book. I give one last little plug on from myself. Just a wonderful book. So
Appreciate
congratulations.
that. Thank you so much.
I'm Chris Bukowski. Thanks for being with us here at the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.